Hello and welcome to another conversation with the Middle East Monitor. Today I'm joined by none other than Professor Norman Finkelstein, born to Holocaust survivors. Professor Finkelstein has spent pretty much his entire professional career writing, commenting, and campaigning on the Palestinian issue. He is the author of over a dozen books with titles including Image and Reality of the Israel-Palestine Conflict, Gaza, an Inquest into its Martyrdom, This Time We Went Too Far, Methods and Madness, The Hidden Story of Israel Assault on Gaza, and of course, many, many more titles, which I don't have the time to cite here. Professor Finkelstein, welcome to the show and thank you for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Well, thank you for having me.
So I've invited Norm, as he would like to be called, to continue really the discussion he raised in one of his books many years back, Knowing Too Much, why the American Jewish romance with Israel is coming to an end. The book's thesis, which we'll get to a bit later, but simply in the simplest form, the idea is that American Jews are overwhelmingly liberal, whereas Israel challenges many of the fundamental values and principles of liberalism, causing a strain in relationship between the two. This tension, as predicted in his book, will play out with American Jewish communities abandoning their support for Israel as they learn more about Israel and what it's doing to the Palestinians. So though Professor Finkelstein, Norm, has predicted this over a decade ago, I think it's fair to say that given the reaction to Israel's latest assault on Gaza, the story is actually playing out as he predicted. So, which is why I wanted to begin with a question on Gaza. Professor, you have 3 books on the subject. This Time We Went Too Far, published in 2010 on the back of Operation Cast Lead, Gaza, an Inquest into its Martyrdom, and Method and Madness, which is what I wanted you to comment on. You argue in that book there is a method and a logic to Israel's siege on Gaza, and the occasional outbursts of deadly aggression, which, I mean, they're not as random as it seems. Speak to us about that and give us your observation of Israel's latest bombardment of the besieged enclave.
I'd first like to just start out with a tiny correction. My main books on Gaza are the ones I published recently, the first being Gaza, an Inquest into its Martyrdom, and then a kind of companion volume, which is called I Accuse. And I Accuse deals with the International Criminal Court and Gaza. So if listeners are interested in my opinions, I would point them to those 2 books. Having said that, the most recent Israeli assault in Gaza actually did not, in terms of its impetus, did not fall into the usual pattern. The usual pattern has been what Israelis called mowing the lawn. Namely, every once in a while, Gaza gets too uppity, or the leadership in Gaza gets too uppity, and it's time to take out the big big club, and crack the skulls of the people in Gaza. That's not what happened this time. I don't think it was an election ploy by Prime Minister Netanyahu, although once the assault in Gaza began, clearly he was engaged in political calculation beginning May 10th. But I don't think that was the impetus, and I don't think it falls in the usual pattern in terms of why Israel launched the assault. It was a gradual escalation, beginning with the repression of the demonstrations in East Jerusalem, in the area, the neighborhood called Sheikh Jarrah. Then it escalated with the Israeli assaults on the worshippers in Al-Aqsa. At that point, Hamas, it's unclear whether it was intended to be a symbolic firing of projectiles or whether it was intended to force an Israeli ground invasion of Gaza. I would say it's still a matter of speculation, but then the projectiles began. And at that point, once the projectile firing began, it did fall into the usual pattern, and the Israelis faced the usual dilemma. The pattern is Hamas fires projectiles. In my opinion, it's incorrect to describe them as rockets, let alone rockets that are technologically sophisticated, which is what Israel claimed. They were projectiles closer to fireworks than a lethal weapon. However, Israel has declared the firing of those projectiles a red line. Now, in my opinion, they were a red line not because they posed any lethal threat to Israel, but they were a red line because Israel decided to declare them a red line for political reasons. And once those projectiles start heading towards Israel, in every single conflict since the 2006 war in Lebanon, Israel always faces the following dilemma. The dilemma is you cannot take out, I hate military expressions, but I'll use it here. You cannot take out these projectiles through aerial assaults. Doesn't work. They have to be eliminated or neutralized in the course of a ground invasion. And so now Israel's faced with the dilemma that it always faces, whether to accept a ceasefire short of declaring a military victory or launching a ground invasion in order to neutralize all of these projectile attacks. Attacks, again, in quotes, because I don't believe they're lethal weapons. And so after about 1 week, that dilemma was faced by Israel. And especially since 2016, but really, 2014, but really going back already to 2006, Israel, faced with that dilemma, was also faced with the prospect of significant combatant casualties. And Israel is no longer an army that's willing to absorb in a ground attack significant combatant casualties. During Operation Protective Edge in July, August 2014, once the ground invasion was launched, 66 Israeli combatants were killed, which is a large number for the Israeli army, which is accustomed to remote control, cost-free wars, which are not wars really, they're massacres. And so they decided, as they did in 2006 in Lebanon, they decide not to launch the ground invasion. And they suffered what must be considered, I think, a major, and one might even say historic, military defeat in Gaza.
If you can pick up on that, you've provided us a really detailed background and the changes in Israel's military calculation. We saw, of course, ground assault in 2008 and 9 and 2014, but there seems to be a kind of a turning of a corner now with the current aggression. What do you put that down to? We saw New York Times, for example, using terms like apartheid and so many other mainstream news outlets. Is this simply a case of, as you use in your book, knowing too much? Is that what's happened? Because we do seem to have turned a corner when it comes to the coverage of Israel and speaking about Israel.
It's hard to gauge exactly what were the factors that contributed to this dramatic shift in public opinion, in news coverage of Gaza. It is a combination of factors, of which I will point to several, but not claiming to be exhaustive. I would want to note, before I enumerate the factors, that Operation Protective Edge in 2014, which was by a wide margin the most destructive of Israel's periodic massacres in Gaza, it didn't actually produce any detectable change in public opinion. Then, if you fast forward to 2018, during the Great March of Return in Gaza, an overwhelmingly non-violent civil resistance with the eminently reasonable goal, though sometimes the goal was obfuscated, but still an eminently reasonable goal of ending the brutal siege of Gaza. Israel killed about 200 nonviolent protesters, mostly young people, and that didn't elicit any significant change in public opinion. And now there is obviously a question worth pondering, a perplexity. Operation, what they call Guardian of the Walls, one of their insane titles of their operations. Operation Guardian of the Walls was one of the shortest of their massacres. Operation Pillar of Defense in 2012 was a little bit shorter, but aside from Pillar of Defense, it was actually quite short. And in terms of destructiveness, you just take one statistic. Operation Guardian of the Walls cost the lives of 66 children. Operation Protective Edge resulted in the deaths of 550 children. And so, as I said, there's an obvious perplexity. Why now? What caused this utterly dramatic shift in public opinion? So I'll give you a few speculations, not claiming that any of them is certain, and for sure, none taken apart is exhaustive. I would say one, it did reach a point of what's called, the expression is critical mass. It reached critical mass, or it reached a tipping point where the accumulation of Israeli horrors inflicted on Gaza reached that critical point, the accumulation beginning with the blockade, then Cast Lead, then Pillar of Defense, then Protective Edge, then the Great March of Return, and now this, that accumulation reached a critical point such that even though this particular massacre was only the tip of the iceberg, it kind of shone a light on the iceberg. That's one, I would say, contributing element. Two, I would say there was a significant influence, impact from the Black Lives Matter movement, this heightened sensitivity to racial injustice, racial oppression, you could see that impact in the following way. If you look at the long trajectory, not so long, but the trajectory of American left politics, you would say the same people who were involved in the Occupy movement many years ago, the Occupy Wall Street movement, were pretty much, though on a larger scale, the ones who were involved in the Bernie Sanders movement. And those same people who were involved in the Bernie Sanders movement were more or less the same people who were involved in the George Floyd demonstrations, the demonstrations after the African American was killed, with the police officer Chauvin having his foot on his neck and on his back. And the same people who were involved in the George Floyd demonstrations were involved in the Palestine demonstrations during Operation Guardian of the Walls. The difference was in the distribution. I was involved in all the demonstrations as a demonstrator, not as an organizer, but I participated. In fact, I was probably the only one over 40 in any of these demonstrations because of COVID. So it was mostly a young people's demonstration. I went, not because I'm a hero, but because I wasn't going to be deterred by COVID. If you went to the Black Lives Matter demonstrations over George Floyd, about 50% were African American at the beginning. And the other 50% were what you might call sympathizers, supporters of the movement. When you went to the Palestine demonstrations during Operation Guardian of the Wall, it was about 50% Arab Muslim, and the other 50%, the same sympathizers, supporters. It was basically the same as it were typed, that beginning with Occupy, then the Bernie Sanders, then the Black Lives Matter, then the George Floyd, and then the Guardian of the Wall, the Palestine. Overwhelmingly young. Now, part of it was due to COVID for sure, but part of it is that's the constituency. It was 20-something. And so you saw the continuities with the Black Lives Matter in terms of the constituencies that came out for these protests and demonstrations. Then you saw it in the hashtags. Now, I'm not a social media person, but I'm familiar at least with the terminology, that's all. And so during George Floyd, of course, it was Black Lives Matter. And then very quickly, during the Palestine demonstrations, the hashtag became Palestinian Lives Matter. And so you saw the precise and conscious continuity between the two. So that was another factor, I think, the ethos created by Black Lives Matter. And it was particularly salient because roughly just a couple of weeks before the Palestine demonstrations in support of the Palestinians, just a couple of weeks before, Human Rights Watch and B'Tselem, the Israeli human rights organization, the main Israeli human rights organization for the occupied Palestinian territories, they came out with very significant publications in which they start to refer to Israel as a state based on Jewish supremacy, that was B'Tselem, and Jewish domination, that was Human Rights Watch. So you can easily imagine the terminology of white supremacy and white domination, which became pervasive in US culture after the Black Lives Matter movement emerged. It was very easy to make the transition from Jewish supremacy and white supremacy and white domination, which were the expressions that dominated the Black Lives Matter discourse. It was very easy to make the transition from white supremacy to Jewish supremacy, white domination to Jewish domination. So that too was a factor. I think the Black Lives Matter. And then another factor which you alluded to, which I think was kind of critical, was our political conversation has polarized between the so-called left and progressives on one side and the Trump white supremacist constituency on the other side. And Jews, when you come to that division, that polarization, Jews instinctively, a bit by habit and by instinct, and also by intellect, I would say, and also by ethos, Jews obviously place themselves in the anti-Trump camp, overwhelmingly place themselves in the anti-Trump camp. And now American Jews were faced with a dilemma. Number one, President Trump celebrated his friendship and alliance and common worldview with Benjamin Netanyahu. That was a problem for American Jews. How are you supposed to be anti-Trump when Trump says he's pro-Netanyahu and pro-Israel? Secondly, Israelis, if you look at the opinion polls, there were only 2 countries in the world where the population was overwhelmingly pro-Trump. There was one country in Africa, I can never remember which one it was, but aside from that, it may have been Liberia, but I won't quote you. Excuse me?
I won't quote you, don't worry.
Yeah. But the other was Israel,
yeah,
where I think it was 74% of the population was pro-Trump. And for American Jews, that just posed a real question. The question is, how much do we really have in common with these people? How much do we really have in common? Yes, we're all Jewish, but these Jews are a little bit alien to the whole.
I think it's safe to say if Trump stood for election in Israel, he's probably the only US president who could win.
Yeah, I think that's probably correct. Yeah. Biden would not have won in Israel. No, impossible. And the other thing is, right at the time that the Israelis launched their latest massacre in Gaza, it coincided with the civil insurgency inside Israel of the Palestinian Israeli population. And the images that were flashed across the media were these Jewish hooligans who were smashing the windows of Arab shops in Lod, in Jaffa, in Haifa. These, what seemed for American Jews who make the kinds of mental associations peculiar to American Jewry, they seemed like pogroms. They seemed like the kinds of things that Jews were the victim of in not the recent history, but not so far in the past either. The grabbing of Arabs from their vehicles and what were called during Operation Guardian of the Walls, called lynchings, the smashing of the glass windows. So those two were images, and this was not soldiers who were carrying out these acts of vandalism and butchery. These were the citizens of the state of Israel. And that, as I said, it had to have caused many American Jews to wonder, what exactly do we have in common with these people, especially at the moment where the organs of Democratic Party, the values of the current Democratic Party, whether it be the New York Times, what's called NPR, National Public Radio, or the main magazines, the New Yorker, New York Review of Books, the many websites which are liberal left, they have been literally day in, day out, headlining, featuring stories about Black Lives Matter. It's been Black Lives, the past year, the newspapers have had three themes: COVID, Black Lives Matter, and Trump. That was it. COVID, Black Lives Matter, and Trump. And so Black Lives Matter and Trump, the American jury were on a different side in Israel. So I think that too was a factor. And then there was just the factor of...
I think, no, I'm sorry to interrupt. You've covered a lot of ground there, saved me from having to ask other questions. But I am conscious of the time. I want to change gears slightly and just fit that conversation within the broader discussion. I mean, the trend you describe in your book and have spoken about here at length is part of, as I said, a wider discussion about America's unquestioning support for Israel. The assumption is that if the bond between Jewish Americans and Israel weakens, US policy will somehow change. And how true is that really? There hasn't been any significant change despite the shift you've mentioned. So are we in danger somehow of overestimating the role of American Jews when it comes to US policy towards Israel? And Israel is simply just invaluable to US hegemony. So it doesn't really matter what happens in US on a cultural and social level. Israel will always remain invaluable to US hegemony in the Middle East, and therefore it will continue its support for Israel. So just widening out the discussion slightly, what do you think of that?
There are several aspects to that question, and I'll try to deal with them systematically. There are areas of Israeli policy. There are areas of Israeli policy which don't overlap with any major US goal in the region. For example, what stake do Americans have in building these settlements? When I say Americans, I mean American ruling elites, as they construe our national interest. Is it in our national interest for Israel to build these settlements? Answer, no. Is there a national interest in the US? Does the US have a national interest in denying Palestinian self-determination in a state constituted by the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza? Answer, no. Wait, did I say yes to the first one? Excuse me. Sorry, I have to go backwards.
It's okay.
What stake does the US have? What national stake does the US have in the settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories and building them? Answer, none.
No, nothing.
What stake does the US have in preventing Palestinians from exercising their right to self-determination in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza, creating a Palestinian state? None. We have no stake in preventing that. So those are Israeli policies, which, in my opinion, the U.S. has supported, not because a national interest is at stake, but because of the Israel lobby. Those are basically functions, those kinds of Israeli policies, which I would call local Israeli policies, are embraced, endorsed, supported, paid for, subsidized by the U.S. because of the Israel lobby. So in my opinion, it's certainly within possibility that the U.S. government would eventually go along with and maybe even exert some pressure to force Israel to accept a full withdrawal from the occupied Palestinian territories and a reasonable resolution of the conflict. However, broadly and regionally, the U.S. and Israel still have a common interest. The common interest right now is to stop Iran. And so there's a common interest between the U.S., the Saudis, the Gulf states, so to speak states, they're just family-owned gas stations, the Saudis, the Gulf states, the U.S., and Israel in trying to prevent a expansion of Iranian influence in the region. Iran basically performs the same role as Egypt did in the 1950s, a regional power which threatens to, quote unquote, and I'm just using the terminology, quote unquote, destabilize the current balance of power in the regions. So there is a common interest. However, even there, where there is a common interest, the U.S. has a different conception of how to constrain Iranian power. The U.S. has supported the 5+1 agreement, which Trump pulled out of, but then Biden clearly,
Iran deal with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, Iran deal, yeah.
Yeah, the U.S. clearly supports that, or did under Obama, and does under Biden. It's seen as in their national interest to constrain Iranian power via this agreement. Israel has a different calculation, which was closer to the national interest as construed by the Trump administration and people like Pompeo. Namely, you have to get it to cry uncle. You have to exert enough pressure that it succumbs to all the U.S. terms for controlling Iran. So there is a broad common interest stopping Iran, but on the means and methods, there's clearly a difference between those supported by Obama and now Biden, and those supported by Israel. Now, there is one other factor which I've not seen yet any significant discussion about, but which I think is going to be, which is looming, and that is Israel came to be a strategic asset in June 1967 when it inflicted a crushing military defeat on the neighboring Arab states, in particular Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. That's when the United States reevaluated the strategic value of Israel and elevated it to a strategic asset, or what came to be called the special relationship with Israel, when it had proved to be a formidable regional military power. I would say after the disaster Israel suffered against Gaza, the military disaster, it suffered against Gaza, which is in length the size of a marathon. A marathon in American measurements is 26.2 miles. Gaza is 25 miles. So in length, it's less than a marathon. If you're a good marathoner, you can go from one end of Gaza to the other in about 3 hours. And in width, Gaza is the size of, let's say, my city, Central Park. In width, it's the size of 2 Central Parks. Gaza also is overwhelmingly children. Its population is 2.1 million. About 55% are children under the age of 18. Yeah. And Gaza is, for all intents and purposes, it's completely demilitarized because there has been a hermetically sealed blockade on Gaza for the last 15 years. And yet, notwithstanding those facts, Israel was not able to inflict a military defeat on it. And that has to be, in my opinion, but I can't prove it, that has to be a sobering fact for American military strategists as they think about Israel's military value to the United States. It remains, of course, technologically cutting edge, but I would say to the extent that Israel was conceived not just as a technological bastion, but also as a fighting army, I would say it's correct to say, especially after what happened between May 10th and May 20th, it's no longer correct to describe Israel as a fighting army. It is domestically incapable of absorbing even double-digit combatant losses. It can't do it anymore.
That's why don't you hold that thought for a while? I mean, we are coming to the end of our show. I want to finish with this question, looking at how things are shifting. I mean, you've been proven right on the issue about the yawning chasm between American Jewry and Israel. But Israel has this capacity to replenish whatever support it may lose. We see this most prominently now with the way Israel has become something of a cause célèbre for many of the far-right politics, far-right extremists in all across the world, Europe and the US as well. How significant is that, for the speed with which American liberal Jews will give up on Israel, and also the direction to which Israel is headed? You mentioned, Israel suffering a huge loss in Gaza. So with that in mind, and also loss of American support of liberals in general, putting your political scientist cap on, which direction would you think Israel would be heading, given its support base from the far right and losing support from progressives? And we want to kind of end with that
I don't
question.
think Israel is capable of readjusting itself at this point. Israel is a deeply entrenched far-right. It's not just a far-right state. It's not just an ultra-right state. It's an ultra-right society. And I think people confuse, in this case, the distinction is important. In other countries, there's an alt-right, as it's called. There's an alt-right, an ultra-right. There's an alt-right, but there's also an alt-left. So in the case of Brazil, there's Bolsonaro, who's the alt-right, but there is an alt-left. There's the Workers' Party. It's still a vigorous opposition force. In the United States, we did have an alt-right government in power. We had Donald Trump. But for every Donald Trump supporter, there was a Bernie Sanders supporter. That's just a fact. I cannot say with certainty, I can't predict with certainty, but I think it's certainly a plausible possibility that had there been an election between Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, Bernie Sanders would have won. So we have an alt-right, but we also have an alt-left in the United States. In the case of Israel, that's simply not true. In Israel, the entire spectrum consists of center-right, far-right, and ultra-right. There's nothing left of center. There's nothing center. There's a center-right, there's a far-right, and there's an ultra-right. That country now, and here I say country, not state, that its citizenry is it's deeply entrenched, and it's not going to budge unless it suffers significant military defeats, not of the kind that it suffered in Gaza, because Gaza poses no security threat to Israel in the real world, but it would require a quite significant blow to budge the Israelis, given how deeply they're entrenched in their right, far right, ultra right politics. So I don't think there's a possibility that they're going to change. In particular, change to accommodate American Jews, it'll never happen. In fact, even with American Jewry, I think personally, having studied this closely for a long time, unless Israel faces a genuine existential threat, I think they've lost American Jewry. And I'll give you an illustration why. In this last Israeli massacre, it's an interesting fact. It's the first time Israel could have made on the surface, genuine claim to self-defense. I'm not saying it's true, but it certainly could have been cast that way, because in the past, it was always Israel provoking Gaza until Gaza finally reacts. You provoke, and Gaza finally reacts. This time, it was Gaza which initiated without a direct provocation. Of course, there are the provocations in Sheikh Jarrah and the provocations at Al-Aqsa Mosque, but there was no direct provocation from Hamas on Gaza. There wasn't a direct provocation. Hamas initiated the rocket attacks, the projectile attacks. So Israel actually had a case for self-defense. And it was very interesting. It didn't get any sympathy. What do I mean by no sympathy? Okay, Israel claims we're under attack. Hamas rockets. Normally, because I go back a ways, normally when Israel claims they're under attack, and there were, as it were, rockets without provocation, without direct provocation, there were quote unquote rockets being fired at Israel. In fact, they were being fired in very large numbers at Jerusalem, at Tel Aviv. It wasn't just the border communities. So Israel had a powerful, relatively speaking, a powerful public relations case to make. What happened? In past decades, whenever Israel claimed to be under attack, there would be an emergency mobilization in support of Israel. It would bring out, literally, this is not hyperbole, it would bring out 1 million Jews in the heart of Manhattan, along Fifth Avenue. Every politician, from your local council person to your mayor to your senator, and federal and U.S. Congress representative, they would all be there making statements of solidarity. Remember, during Operation Protective Edge in 2014, the mayor of New York, Michael Bloomberg, he flew right to Israel and said, don't be afraid to come, it's safe, the airport is safe. What happened this time? There were 2 demonstrations in support of Israel in New York, each of which had about 500 supporters, 500.
Same here in the UK, the pro-Palestinian demonstration, 200,000, pro-Israeli demonstration, 1,500. So yeah.
500, no elected official showed up. None. The most vehement, virulent supporter of Israel is the Senate Majority Leader, Chuck Schumer. The most powerful Jew in the history of the United States, and the 3rd most powerful official in the United States, who also is Jewish, Charles Schumer. He didn't utter a word. He didn't utter a word during Operation Guardian of the Woods, not a word. So that tells me we crossed the Rubicon. The days of American Jewish support for Israel, short of a genuine existential threat, short of, it's over. I don't think Israel is going to use the word replenish its support or recuperate its support or bounce back. No. Israel has become an alien society to American Jews. Yes, they're Jewish, but really, how much did American Jews have in common, en masse, with Sheldon Adelson? Okay, Sheldon Adelson is Jewish, but most American Jews saw nothing in common with him. And it's the same thing. Most Israelis are like Sheldon Adelsons. You know?
I think on that note, we've covered a lot of ground, Norm, and it's been really, really insightful. And I think we are headed in the direction you are, in my view as well, you are predicting. And politics, as has been said before, politics is downstream from culture and society. Culture and society has definitely changed. And I think in the end, politics will have to catch up. I think, we could carry on with this conversation, and there's lots to be said, but you've actually covered more grounds than I've actually calculated for. And it's been amazing having you on the show. So I'm really delighted that you joined us, and hopefully we can do this again soon on another theme and on another topic, and pick your brain on other issues as well. So before I leave, how's your health been generally? You've been okay?
I'm fine.
Thank you. All right. So thank you very much. And I want to thank the viewers who have joined us through Facebook and YouTube. And see you again soon for another MEMO conversation. Goodbye at home. And thank you, Norm, and see you again soon. Bye-bye.